Welcome to the walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes for assignment 1B. First and foremost, make sure to document your code. A lot of people simply aren't documenting the code properly, so you'll lose points if you don't correct this by the time you do your final solution. Secondly, make sure that you initialize the fields that need to be initialized. I don't know how this problem could have snuck by because the unit test should have crashed and burned. So if you were getting null pointer exceptions, that's definitely something you need to fix, and you need to make sure you initialize the fields properly. Also, make sure you give explicit initial values to the constructor when you initialize the fields. You don't need to make the count inside the spin lock an atomic integer. Just a simple int will do fine, so please do that. People had a number of problems with try-lock. This code is way too complicated. I'm not sure what it's trying to do, but it's doing more than it needs to do, that's for sure. Likewise, please try to write code as a one-liner here. Just return the comparison. You don't need to do if such and such, return true, else return false. That's unnecessarily complicated. Down here, you need to make sure that you're handling this code properly. In particular, you need to make sure that you're checking to see whether something is canceled, so make sure you're canceling things properly. And you should also make sure that you're that in this case you're yielding. I'll talk more about that in a second. You don't need to use holds lock. Just check to see whether the current thread equals the thread that returns from mowner.get. Please use lock count ++ rather than lock count equals lock count +1. Make sure to use the try-lock method in implementing your lock class. And I can't for the life of me figure out what's going on here. This setting of the field to false unilaterally in the lock value in the lock method completely and totally defeats the point of the spin lock. So that demonstrates a deep misunderstanding of what's trying to be going on with atomic objects. So make sure you think carefully about this and don't do things like that. Down here, this makes no sense. It's basically trying to duplicate the same code that's in try-lock for no particular reason. I have no idea what's going on here, but it's certainly wrong. Down here, the code for checking to see whether something's canceled needs to move inside the while loop body, not just sitting by itself at the end. That defeats the whole purpose of trying to check whether cancellation has occurred. And then likewise down here, you need to make sure that you add a thread.yield call within the body of the while loop in order to give other threads a chance to run. This will particularly show up if you were to only have a single thread that was trying to acquire the Palantir, or two threads that were trying to acquire the Palantir. They would end up, one of them would end up spinning excessively, so you don't want to do that. There were also quite a number of problems with unlock. In particular, you don't need to throw any exceptions if the owner thread is not the current thread. There's no specification that requires that, so don't do it, please. Don't be checking whether the owner is alive. That makes no sense. There's a bunch of problems with this particular code. And for goodness sakes, don't set the owner equal to a new atomic reference. All you have to do is call the set method on owner and set that to the appropriate value. But don't be creating a new atomic reference. That's very wasteful and really makes no sense. Down here in unlock, something very important is missing. You need to think carefully about the conditions under which you can release the lock. You can only release the lock if you own the lock, and this code is not doing that. This is also some mistakes in terms of what the if-else statements are doing. They're nested incorrectly. In particular, this code also is releasing the lock even though it's not the owner of the lock. So the thread is doing this even though it's not the owner. And you shouldn't use compare and set here. You should just use set and do it correctly, of course. Same point down here. This is sort of redundant on that. Just go ahead and use set appropriately. Don't use compare and set. There's no need to do that. And also don't be setting mowner equal to null. That makes no sense at all. That completely defeats the purpose, and you'll end up with getting null pointer exceptions very quickly next time you try to use the lock if you set the owner to null. Make sure you set the field in the spin lock hash map manager to be spin lock, not cancelable lock, not spin lock. I think everybody's got that fixed now. A few people had that problem early on, but I think that's fixed. This code is sort of a mystery to me. I'm not sure why get Palantir is being called twice. That doesn't make any sense. and you don't need to do something as complicated as this. I'm not sure what this is trying to do, but it's way too complicated. Just use the for each method on the Palantiri list, and you'll be fine. Some other problems in build model. So avoid using index-based for loops in Java. If instead you can use a for each loop, or perhaps even better, the for each method, which you can in this case. Index-based loops are just a problem waiting to happen because it's too easy to get an off by one error, and it's just extra work, so why do it? No clue why the semaphore is being set to an initial value of 1. That's, of course, not going to work at all, and your unit tests should have blown up, which should have given you a clue that something was wrong. So when your unit tests are blowing up, that's a good sign to come to office hours and get help. And it's also a good example of why you need to start the assignment early. Waiting to the very last minute and then having problems is not a good idea. And of course, it's even worse if you're not running the unit test, because then you have no idea what your code is going to do. This code is also way too complicated. Just use the for each method. Don't use the for each loop with entry set. That's overkill. No need to do that. Down here, we start getting into some of the problems with the acquire method on the Spinlock hash map manager. Various problems here. People were trying to get too clever in a lot of cases. In this case, this code is going to crash if there's no Palantir that's available, which you clearly don't want to have happen. You'll get a null pointer exception, so don't do that. Make sure that you acquire the Spinlock before you try to access the contents of the hash map. A surprisingly large number of people either forgot to do that in acquire and or they forgot to do it in release. So that completely and totally misses the point of why we're adding the Spinlock. The whole purpose of having the Spinlock is to avoid having multiple threads try to manipulate the hash map without synchronization being enacted properly. Don't do this kind of code. There were lots of variations of this. Don't be using get and put in this manner in acquire. Instead, loop through the entry set using a for each loop and use get value and set value methods on the entry set. It's much, much faster. It's linear time as opposed to having the extra calls to get and put here, which we'll have to go and search through the hash map again. This is clearly the wrong thing to pass as a parameter to the lock. You don't want to pass false. That just means you'll never be able to cancel the lock, and your code will spin even after the cancel button is pushed on the GUI. Go back and watch the videos where we talked about how to do this. I described the appropriate method reference to pass in here. Here you can see that once again we have some kind of weird problems here. In particular, we kind of get a little too cute in this case. Once again, we're checking for null, which is good, but then down in this code it makes no sense whatsoever. This is way too inefficient. You don't need to be going through and searching like this. That's really defeating the purpose of using the streams framework. So I recommend getting rid of the streams framework unless you really know how to use it. Don't do this stuff. Instead, do something like this and rearrange the code. And notice also that you've got a problem here because the lock is only unlocked if p equals, or p does not equal null. If p equals null up here, then the lock is acquired, incorrectly of course, but it's acquired, and yet it's never released. So make sure you think carefully about how your code matches up so that locks get unlocked. Again, that should probably be something that'll be caught by the unit tests, so make sure you're running the unit tests and figuring out why they're not working. Here, the person's trying to call try lock in acquire. That, of course, is really missing the point. You're supposed to call lock in acquire because you want to block until the lock is available. If the lock is not available, then in this case, you're just not going to acquire at all, which is not what you want to do. And this code is also unnecessarily expensive. You can just use set val on the Palantir entry set rather than trying to call put again. So think carefully about every method call you do, and is it the most efficient way to do things? And if not, think carefully about a better way to do it. You need to make sure that you always unlock the lock in the finally block, which means that even if an exception is thrown for some reason, the lock will be released. So make sure you do that. Don't just have naked calls to unlock. That's not a good idea. Down here, similar problem, doing some clever stuff with the stream, but then using replace, which is not an efficient way to do things. You're better off if you're going to not do the streams implementation as efficiently as you possibly can. You need to make sure that you use a for each loop that iterates to the entry set. Also, this code, I believe, will blow up if you get back a null for some reason, which is unlikely, but it could happen. And so you're just going to go ahead and replace null with false, which is not correct at all. Here's some other problems we see here with release. So first and foremost, make sure you always check whether the Palantir is null before you do anything else, and bail out right away if it's null. You don't want to be trying to put null Palantir into the map. This code is also way too inefficient. You don't need to be iterating through the entry set. Instead, you need to be calling put or replace, which is much more efficient. We'll talk about how to call put and replace correctly in just a moment. Down here, you need to first check whether the Palantir is null before you do anything else. So this needs to move outside the code and not inside the try finally block, because you'll get yourself into trouble in that case. There is no reason whatsoever to call get inside of release. That makes no sense. The other method that you would use, the put method, for example, is the right thing to do. Or replace. This code here, make sure that you move the check for whether release should be called after unlock, not before it. It's more efficient to unlock the lock and then call release rather than call release and then unlock the lock. That just makes things work faster. This code is completely confused. For some strange reason, the person is checking to see if the put or replace call returned false correctly, and in that case, they release the lock conditionally. You never release the lock conditionally. You always release the lock. You want to conditionally release the semaphore, and this call should be moved up here inside the finally part of the code, not outside the finally part. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that we always release things even if an exception is thrown. If you should release at all, and of course, you need to conditionally do release. This down here illustrates that a little bit more clearly. Make sure that if the call to put or replace, if you use that, succeeds, where succeeds means returns false, only in that case will you call release. So you don't just unilaterally call release. And again, you want to make sure that these calls to unlock are called in the finally block, and the call to release is called in the finally block. There were a number of very odd results for the available permits method. You don't return the Palantir count. You return the number of the semaphore permits that are currently available. I'll let you guess what that method is. It's pretty easy to figure out once you look at the semaphore interface. This code is certainly a problem. It's going to call itself recursively forever and end up blowing up the program with infinite recursion. And this is also the wrong method to call. I'm not quite sure why drain permits would be called here. Drain permits basically gets rid of all the permits, and you just want to return the count of the currently available permits, which is a dynamic value that's available through an API call on the semaphore. And again, look at the semaphore API. It's very simple to figure out what that call should be. So those are the frequently made mistakes that I saw. Some people did very well. In that case, good job. Almost everybody, I think everybody has something to fix. Some people really struggled mightily with this program. This program is really not very hard. So if you have problems, if you have a lot of comments, if you are struggling to know how to understand atomic objects, atomic variables, if you're struggling to understand things like hash maps or the methods to call on hash maps, if you're struggling to understand semaphores or synchronizers or spin locks, make sure you come to office hours. Make sure you ask questions on Piazza. And for certain, make sure you run the unit tests, because those things will give you a lot of insights about why things aren't working.